Welcome everyone. We're going to get this started now. I'm Kirsten Lovejoy. I was the Brisbane Central candidate for the Queensland Greens during the last state election. I guess I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners and recognise that this was, is and always will be their land where we're meeting tonight. I want to also just run through a couple of housekeeping issues. Now, we do have a live stream camera action happening tonight as well. So if anybody's camera shy or just does not want to be on the camera, if you'd like to move over to that side of the room, and then where Matt's waving, and if you really want to be on the camera, you might want to move over to this side of the room up the front, but that's up to you. We can wait while that happens. Now, another thing is that if you have your mobiles on, if you would please turn those to silent, that would be wonderful, much appreciated. And I guess it's probably worth mentioning that we're all aware that the budget is out now, and that's why we're here tonight, to hear what our position is on that, as well as the speakers that are here. I think it's safe to say that once again they've locked in the same cuts that they had before, and it is still taking care of the big end of town at the expense of people who can least afford it. And so I think it'll be really valuable to hear what's being said tonight and see what we can do about that and what our vision is for the future. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome this wonderful line of guest speakers here who have an amazing amount to say, and we've got Larissa Waters, of course, here, our wonderful senator. But we're going to start tonight with Karyn Walsh, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Micah Projects and has 35 years' experience in the community sector, developing organisations and implementing programs to create opportunities for personal and social change. Ms Walsh has been involved with Micah Projects since it was incorporated in 1995, operating a community-based not-for-profit organisation with a vision to create justice. As part of this mission, Micah Projects established the Brisbane Domestic Violence Service, which is a confidential program catering to the needs of those who have been affected by domestic violence. In 2013 to 14, Micah Projects provided support and advocacy services to 6,770 adults and 1,761 children, responding to over 50,000 casual contracts throughout the year. So I'd like you to welcome Karyn to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past and present as well. And also to just say we didn't actually start the Brisbane Domestic Violence Service. We built on the work of the Domestic Violence Resource Centre, and we had a contract transfer as part of the pressures of the community sector in terms of viability. So I just want to acknowledge all those great women in the Domestic Violence Resource Centre who actually did set the organisation up. But we have continued to do the work in the same philosophy and work towards, and we're now working towards an integrated response to domestic violence in the Brisbane region, which for the first time we've actually got funding to do. So we're very excited about the opportunity of looking at how we can work with police. We have put a model up as a co-respondent model, but it's freaking everyone out a bit. So we're going to keep working that through with the police to see if there's ways in which responding at a much earlier stage that there's a greater take-up of services by women and children and greater accountability of perpetrators through working in the system across police, non-government agencies, government and probation and parole. And obviously for the federal budget, there wasn't a great deal of funding, but I don't think there's enough vision really to fund how to respond to domestic violence. Certainly they're continuing the National Centre of Violence Against Women, and more money was given to the Respect line after post-budget. But I think at a federal level, the issues around families impact on people experiencing violence, because we know that poverty is how women experience violence across the different socio-economic groups it's very diverse, but poor women certainly have less resources, and women from higher socio-economic backgrounds often don't have access to services or don't have the same ability to, they have different issues that impact on them. Like we had a woman last week who had a bank, you know, who had resources but couldn't access any of them. So in the end, they're thrust into poverty pretty quickly and thrust into having to rely for pretty significant financial issues, their family, and certainly we're seeing a lot of people from coal backgrounds where immigration issues and not being citizens, if they haven't got citizenship, those issues are all sort of in the mix of what needs to be addressed for women and children to be safe. Obviously the work of the centre and that Natasha and them are doing is fantastic work, but a lot of the barriers to it going to get anywhere is that there isn't a national vision on what we need to do. There is complicated systems that need to be integrated, so the family law court obviously is under federal jurisdiction and the state justice system is under state jurisdiction, so the kind of programs that you need to get information sharing across those, because we know that the deaths of women and children is certainly connected to family law issues. So that's something that we hope in the future will be looked at. There's some great initiatives around, you know, safe, but they're lacking any funding to make the kind of difference and scale of difference that they need, like keeping women safe at home. And obviously there's a shortage of refuge for the number of people that are now seeking refuge. So really there's not a great deal to say about the federal budget and domestic violence, because it's good the centre's going, but it is a joint funded, I think it's 30 million that is Commonwealth state funding, so it's through the COAG agreements, yeah. And the 16.7 million over 3 years is what's been committed to it. So I think we've got to do a lot more work on policy to actually then have a budget that means something, because just putting funding fits, or like the National Partnership on Homelessness, you know, it's just been a tagline, you know, address domestic violence. Well, those programs, I mean, we run several of them, and they are not for that target group, even though we could report on the extent of domestic violence through our programs. That would be a good thing, because we deal with it on a weekly basis, but they're not specialist domestic violence services. But I think the way all governments can get into just putting a tagline to something and saying it's a response to an issue lacks some depth that the issue really needs, and it sounds like there's a budget amount to it, but in fact it's a very minor contribution. It's still important that you know, we do look at, I mean, I agree that we should be looking at domestic violence across all our programs. There's not one program we run that domestic violence isn't an issue in, but our specialist domestic violence programs have a particular role in getting the coordination between systems to ensure that women and children are safe. And at the moment, the big gap in that is specialist courts in both the family law jurisdiction. The Labor government here is looking at implementing some trials, I think, of specialist courts, magistrates' courts. You know, I think all these things need to be trialled, particularly where there's evidence that they've made a difference in other communities. But we've got a long way to go to see how they're going to make a difference in Queensland, because we haven't even started. So federally, I hope that through the centres that there is a lot more emphasis on how the state jurisdiction and the federal jurisdiction can actually work together to not have the silos that women and children have to go through and the hoops they have to go through now in order to prove or be believed that domestic violence happens or is happening to them at the time, because really the evidence is there. You only have to look at the number of breaches, the number of times it's been reported. we have a huge issue still, which, you know, I've been involved since the 70s, and women still are not believed. It's still doubted that what they're saying is actually happening, or what part of the conflict did they play. I think the attitude of women to women is a crucial part, and the inequality of women and how people, how men see women still has so much work to look at the cultural norms that we have. And, you know, you see bumper stickers that, you know, say things like, you know, I wish I could, something about drowning their wife, but, you know, I can't get my wife to come swimming with me, when we know that there's been significant domestic violence murders from drowning. You know, things that I think we have to put a lot of attention to those attitudes at the same time that we're actually providing the services. It can't be an either or. It's got to be both. And issues of equality, issues of how women are going to be left without childcare for up to 12 hours a week in this budget, how their children are going to be disadvantaged from that. People need childcare when they're dealing with a crisis. Children need. We know the impact of childcare and mitigating the effects of trauma. So all of the budget measures around families and the inequity between what lower income families are going to receive and higher income families all contribute to how people in a crisis can actually sustain their own incomes, because, you know, that's what's disrupted. It's people's work, it's people's ability to pay rent, or their ability to stay in a house, or they have to usually get out pretty quickly. So I think it's looking grim from this budget for a lot of people who still, the harsh measures that were put in last year's budget are still there for many low-income people. And we're really creating and entrenching a culture in our society of the deserving and non-deserving, and participation around work over other forms of caring and roles that people need to play, and people should have the ability to consider those roles without penalty from services like childcare.
Thank you, Karyn. I went along to a forum last night where we were listening to a great panel of people talking about those same issues, and I think it's safe to say that we do need to invest more, and we don't want to keep those cuts that this Abbott government has put in place, and we just need to focus on achieving those goals. And I guess one of the key things there is, let's keep the pressure on the Labor government to make those pilot projects happen, and put the pressure on to make sure we're looking after our women and children that are in these situations. Thank you, Karyn. So our second speaker tonight is Mr. Alex Scott. Now, Alex is the Secretary of Together Queensland, which is an organisation of approximately 39,000 Queenslanders, I'm one of them, who are passionate about harnessing the collective power of workers to make change, build better lives and deliver quality services for the community. Together represent a broad range of workers from the public and private sectors, including health professionals, child protection and disability support workers, scientists and administrative professionals. Prior to his current position with Together, Mr. Scott was the president of the Queensland Public Sector Union, which amalgamated with the Australian Services Union and contributed to the start of Together in 2011. Thank you, Alex, if you'd like to.
Thanks for that kind introduction. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners where we meet tonight. In terms of my presentation today, what I wanted to do was talk about the federal government's budgetary policies, but both talk about the 2014 budget as well as the 2015 budget, because I think we need to put both of them into context. In terms of the broader consideration about what the budget is about, I think we need to think through the various levers that politicians have in relation to creating the sort of society that they want. and those are primarily either through the spending of money through the budget or through their legislative program. And what we've seen from our perspective in relation to the 2015 budget is very clearly a political budget, very much in line with the Howard-style buy every vote you can before the next election approach, where clearly a lot of the issues that were raised in the 2014 budget and the rhetoric and the ideology that was espoused at that point in time have been abandoned for short-term political opportunism. Clearly this budget was based around focus groups and polling rather than what the Abbott government really wants to achieve in relation to changing the nature of Australian society. So from our analysis around what it particularly means in relation to the health sector, what we are looking at is the 2014 and 2015 budgets as a combined entity rather than thinking that somehow the Abbott government should be judged purely on their current budgetary process, which is about delivering a number of votes in a number of marginal seats. I think in terms of the shift between the 2014 and the 2015 budget really has been a very significant watering down of the budget crisis that the government was able to create with the support of the Murdoch press and others. And I'd certainly encourage anybody in Queensland to stop reading the Courier Mail about anything. Particularly at the moment in relation to the Queensland state government, but we have to understand that just what the Courier Mail is, it's now a political broadsheet for the Murdoch press, and I think certainly for those people who want to continue paying for it, you should probably lodge that as a political donation to the LNP every time, if that's required under LNP governments. But what we saw in relation to the rhetoric at the moment is that this is a government that's now trying to listen and trying to clearly have a political approach. But there is an underlying issue in relation to what they've done in relation to the 2014 versus 2015 budget. And part of that is that they made very significant changes to what they wanted in relation to Australian society in the 2014 budget, and they failed to deliver those because, as with lots of governments, they think that once you've got control of the lower house, that somehow gives you a mandate to deliver whatever you like. And what they found in terms of the last budget wasn't that it was deeply unpopular because they knew it was going to be deeply unpopular. What they failed to understand was the power of the Senate. And I think particularly the Greens have played a vital role in providing leadership through the Senate with people like Senator Waters and others, making sure that they were able to take a tough stand despite the popular press and say that they were willing to fight for their mandate rather than get bullied into the mandate of Abbott. So the challenges that the government has now done since the 2015 budget has been not the fact that they've dropped unpopular or deeply unpopular policies, has to been recognising the fact that they have got a Senate that's willing to stand up to them, and it's those parts of the 2014 budget that they've dropped were the ones that required legislative change. And so they were willing to pursue very unpopular policies if they were only budget policies, and because of the fact of the constitutional requirements that the Senate can't block the budget bills, anything else is fair game. And so in relation to higher education and a range of the other, and the co-payment in particular, they were blocked by the legislation. So it wasn't that the Abbott government has suddenly decided that 2014 was an unpopular budget and so they've changed their mind. What we've seen is that they've accepted the political reality that the Senate will stand up, particularly with the Greens and the crossbenchers, providing the leadership to say that despite the fact that the government has a majority in the lower house, doesn't give them a blank cheque in relation to changing the sort of society that they wanted. So then thinking about what they actually wanted to achieve rather than what they could actually achieve in terms of the 2014 budget, it was a very regressive budget and continues to be the ideology of the LNP about delivering the sort of society that they want. The only thing that overrides ideology from LNP politicians is self-interest. And the fact is that while they want to change society in ways I don't think anybody in this room would support, they're more interested in getting re-elected than they are in terms of delivering that process. So we've seen a backflip in relation to the poor press that the Prime Minister was getting about the failure to negotiate activities and legislation through the crossbenchers and the Greens. But at the end of the day, that was about saving Abbott's leadership, saving him through the polls and setting up for what we believe will be an election before we see the 2016 budget, because while the 2015 budget is about sweeteners, we don't see what the 2016 budget could be in terms of the chickens coming home to roost around a range of very dodgy figures in relation to long-term assessment. So we expect this is the election budget. Our analysis at this stage is that that Abbott was going to lose the leadership unless he had a popular budget. This budget is so popular that he'll survive in the leadership, but he then can't produce a 2016 budget, which will show exactly what's happening around some of the depreciation rates and other things. So we think this will mean that we are now facing a federal election before the middle of next year, rather than this government going full term. But going back to what the 2014 budget was really about changing society in a way that was about under the pretext of a budget crisis, which was primarily driven by a downturn in the economy, but also by a range of choices that Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey made about making the budget look worse than it was. They then said that we then needed to change society in a radical way in relation to removing the concept of universality in a range of areas. So where a number of people think that the role of government is to try and make society fairer as well as making the economy stronger, clearly last year's budget was about making society less fair and about putting those people with money in a better position than those people without money. And that was driving the higher education changes and a range of other things. But also issues such as the co-payment was very much, they would talk about it being a price signal. And that if you had over $7 co-payment, it would discourage people from going to the doctor. And that's what it was about. It wasn't about saying they were funding scientific research. That was just a spin process of justifying the process. What they wanted to do was have less Australians going to see the doctor because it was costing the government money every time you see the doctor. And what that was about a $7 process to say that if you were sick or if your child was sick, would $7 discourage you from going to the doctor? And while that $7 was universally applied, clearly what that meant is people on $250,000 a year are going to be less worried about spending $7 to see a doctor than someone on $35,000 a year. So in terms of a regressive policy, the price signals that were introduced and luckily failed through the co-payment process was about trying to effectively mean that if you reduce every piece of service to a dollar value, that looks fair at one level, but clearly is deeply unfair. And then also in relation to the tax changes and other things that were being proposed, clearly it was the lower socioeconomic groups were going to bear the enormous brunt of the 2014 budget. Luckily, a lot of those changes didn't get through because of the legislative program in the upper house being stalled and stopped by the Greens and by others. We shouldn't expect, though, that after the next election that these issues won't be revisited because there will be another budget crisis. We know that the budget figures are wrong at the moment. They will get worse, and then after the next election, if Abbott is returned, he will then have another black hole that he'll discover as a result of the dropping iron ore price, or they'll find climate change is real, or find something as a justification for a budget crisis, which will allow the ideological attacks on society to be recommenced, hopefully from their point of view, with a revised mandate. But there were some very fundamental changes that were about the way society operates that this government was able to introduce and is continuing to pursue because they didn't need legislative support to do that. So in terms of the ability for the upper house to be able to influence and do these things, there is very limited opportunity for the Senate to have an impact on straight money bills. And in terms of the three major attacks that have been put in place and are continuing to be put in place from the 2014 budget and into the 2015 budget around the NDIS, around education and around health funding. And Kevin will talk later about the education issues in particular. But in terms of this process, we have a fundamental problem in Australia, as you'd all be aware, that at the moment the state government is responsible for providing and delivering very important social services in relation to education, health and a range of other areas, but it doesn't have the taxation revenue to fund those services. And as a result of the significant reforms undertaken previously by the Rudd and Gillard years, particularly by Rudd, was a recognition that we needed a strong and well-funded universal healthcare system plus an education system through the Gonski reforms and through the NDIS. And in terms of that process, what we saw was some very significant agreements being entered into between the states and the federal government in relation to how the government would fund the states. So trying to move away from what Rudd called the blame game to start talking about giving some guaranteed long-term funding for the states to deliver those in those three key areas, but through the NGO sector for NDIS, but the state still has a major funding role. What happened last year was that they had this budget crisis they created. They had the intergenerational report that they forgot to release, plus their own audit commission, which they forgot to release early enough, which then said that we're all going to be ruined by 2030, and so therefore there need to be radical change made. They introduced a whole range of changes, most of which couldn't get through the Senate, but they had $40 billion worth of savings, which were effectively cuts to the state government in relation to education and health, at the same time that they could still find money for vital social services such as new aeroplanes and submarines for the Air Force and the Navy. But in terms of the 2015 budget, while they've recognised that they're now a thinking and caring government for everything they can't get through the Senate, they haven't reversed those changes in relation to the national health reform. They haven't reversed those changes in relation to Gonski and NDIS. And what that will mean is that there was a clear recognition under the national health reform agreements that were entered into by the previous federal government was that healthcare costs is increasing more and more every year, and healthcare costs increase faster than the general cost of living. So what that meant was that there were some guaranteed arrangements under the national health reform package, first of all to say that the funding for hospitals should be based on how much it costs to run a hospital. Sounds like a radical concept, but that was the basic fundamental of it, that they would work at the national efficient price and the federal government would fund 50% of the healthcare moving forward. So it costs more to run the hospital, the state government would have to pick up half the bill and the federal government would have to pick up half the bill. Then there was a second reform arrangement which also then dealt with specifically around reforms around the emergency room processes and around the surgery guarantee processes, so making sure that waiting lists and emergency rooms were specifically dealt with additional funding. What the federal government did was effectively say, well, we're going back, we're going to still deliver more money in health year after year after year. And they are guaranteed to do that. This year they're going to spend more on health than they did last year, and next year they're going to spend more on health than they did this year. And they will go to the same election as did Campbell Newman, saying they are improving health funding. What they're not saying is they're not improving health funding fast enough. And the fact is that the health funding that they're going to say that starts to cut in at the end of the health reform program will be linked to changes in population, which means for those states shrinking, their funding will go down, but the general CPI figure, rather than the actual cost, which is of the healthcare services. And healthcare probably is going to be running about twice the normal CPI, so probably about 5% compared to around the kind of 2–2.5% that general CPI will be. So what that will mean is there'll be a bigger and bigger gap from the funding to the states, but also there was the abandonment of the commitment to the 50% funding. And so what we're going to see in Queensland over the next 10 years is about $12 billion less to fund our health system than we would have had if the National Health Agreement had stayed in place. And so that's going to be about 400 or 500 million. Exact figure for Metro North, which I always get wrong, is $2.3 billion less for Prince Charles and the RBWH to run over the next 10 years. So it's about $250 million a year less just in Metro North for the delivery of health services. And that's then occurring across the state and across every state across the country. And what that means is basically that this government is committed to trying to underfund the health system. They're trying to underfund the health system because they're committed to private healthcare, not public healthcare. If you look at it from an economic and rational point of view, public health is the best way of delivering healthcare. If you look at it as a percentage of GDP compared to America with a kind of privatised system, we spend less on healthcare in Australia as a percentage of GDP, and we get a much better outcome for it. And we also make sure everybody gets dealt with based on their medical need, not on how much they earn, not on whether they've got a job or not on where they live. So the whole concept of universal healthcare is something that this government doesn't believe in and is about saying that healthcare should be a safety net, not a universal entitlement and not a universal quality of service. So what we're going to see over a period of time is a debate that is going to get dragged into the kind of blame game of the federal versus the state governments. But the underpinning position from the LNP will be, and from the ABBA government, is that this is about the minimum we can spend on health and having public health care as a safety net, driving people into private health insurance, and then making sure that, that those people who can afford it get the best quality health care in the world, and those people who can't afford it die younger and die in more pain and they have to suffer for a lot longer. So in terms of that process, that is the real ideological agenda out of the 2014 budget, which has been driven back into the 2015 budget. From a political point of view, this is very confused because the federal government knows they can do this because they're not going to be the one cutting the savings, making the savings. They're not going to be the one who are going to be turning patients away from hospitals. It's going to be the state government in every state in Australia. And so from that perspective, they think they can get away with this process and force the debate to being a state government problem. And clearly the states don't have the ability to raise enough taxes to fund healthcare. The states will go broke in 10 years if they have to continue to provide the same quality of healthcare as they currently do and fund it on the way the federal government wants to, with the Commonwealth government walking away from it. From a progressive politics point of view, the real challenge around this isn't just the debate about where healthcare should go, because I think there is enormous community support for a properly funded healthcare system, and whether it's holding the state government accountable for it or whether it's holding the federal government accountable for it, the real risk is going to be about what the taxation solution to healthcare is. And I think in terms of that, the Camp David retreat that was announced after the last COAG meeting, which said that they weren't going to talk about the $40 billion worth of cuts to healthcare, but all the premiers and the Prime Minister are going to go away to some sort of retreat near Canberra and come away with this grand package of reform is going to be a real challenge, we believe, from a taxation point of view. Because we certainly believe that it is appropriate that the state governments, the federal government, the local government generate enough tax to provide the quality of services we need. But how we generate that tax income is fundamentally important to fairness within society. When Costello introduced the GST, he was able to convince everybody that this was a good idea for the state governments because this was a growth tax. And it was. It's better that state government have a tax that increases over time. But it's a fundamentally regressive tax in that it taxes everybody at the same rate rather than those who can afford to paying more as they do with income tax, or it also means that the states are completely devoid of any corporate taxability by and large, other than kind of some very minor issues around stamp duty and payroll tax. And our real concern at the moment is that the debate around the crisis within education and health is going to become a debate about whether the GST should go up. And by saying it's just about the GST and the GST is the only thing that can fund the states, it removes the ability for progressive forces to say it shouldn't be the GST going up, it should be taxing multinationals. It should be making sure that we crack down on some of the superannuation rewards for extremely high income earners who are very close to retirement. It removes the ability of the largest part of the spending of any jurisdiction, being state health and education, to being linked to one element of taxation rather than a combined conversation about how all governments generate all taxation income and having a separate conversation about how that money is spent in terms of making society a fairer process. So from our point of view, the real challenge in terms of the 2015 budget is not only confronting the issue of universality and ensuring there is broad community support around making sure that healthcare can be delivered on the basis of need, not income, and based not on where you live. We think that the issues around the attacks to healthcare and the attacks to education and NDIS are really a stalking horse, not only in relation to attacking the universality of those issues, but also getting into a situation where they can buy the state governments into a situation where they say an increase in GST is appropriate, and excluding the broader community from a debate about what taxation systems we should have and the fairness of the taxation systems as well as the level of the taxation systems. Because at the end of the day, the Australian population supports a well-funded education system, supports a well-funded healthcare system, and supports a strong NDIS. And they want taxes to match that. But if you ask them whether they want GST or another tax, which is about kind of corporate tax or appropriate balance in relation to fairness, they will say they want a fair tax system, not an increase in the GST. But that's not going to be the question they're going to be asked in the current debate. What we're going to be faced with is it, do you want to kind of increase GST with decent hospitals and healthcare and schools, or do you want to have a low GST and let your schools and hospitals deteriorate over the next 10 years? So from our point of view, the budget in 2014 was a strongly regressive budget. It was an attack on the nature of society that the most progressive people want. The 2015 budget is a political budget to get them past the next federal election and get them past Abbott's leadership problems. But the challenge for progressive groups across Australia is about making sure that in relation to the debate that we have in the lead up to the next federal election about the sort of society we want, we can't allow the COAG process between the state and federal government to be the only conversation we have about taxation, because in terms of that process, we need quality healthcare, we need quality schools, but the sort of taxation system we should have shouldn't be limited to just a GST debate.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was very pertinent, obviously. I think it reminds us as well that there was a great documentary that came out by Michael Moore, which looked at the American health system and compared it to those around the world, and I think that he mentioned something about 3 years. People die 3 years earlier in America, and if that's not enough to remind us that in fact, you know, we want to keep our system, our healthcare system that we have now, and not whittle it away like the Abbott government seems to want to do all of the time, then we need to really keep pushing hard to keep that social equity in place, and looking at their very apparent move towards increasing the GST is once again that another hit on the people who can least afford it. So thank you very much, Alex. I guess there were a few other points that were really you brought home as well, and that was that, you know, we need people like Senator Larissa Waters in place to keep pushing against standing up to this government. We also need Greens in the lower house to work at in that other direction as well, do the pincer move. Another key point was don't buy the Courier Mail, so let's not forget that. So our final speaker, and forgive me, I forgot to mention that we'd be holding questions after this, so bear with us, and after Larissa's spoken. Our third speaker now is Kevin Bates. And Kevin is the president of the Queensland Teachers Union, which represents over 96% of eligible teachers with approximately 44,000 members. Mr. Bates took up the position of president of the QTU in January 2012. Prior to that, he was regional organiser in South Queensland and industrial advocate for the union. As an executive member of the QTU and the Australian Education Union, Mr. Bates represents a wide range of stakeholder groups within the education portfolio. He has extensive experience as a secondary social science teacher and advanced tertiary qualifications in mediation and negotiation. So please welcome Kevin to the floor.
Thank you very much. And in opening, I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples on whose land we're gathered, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight in addressing the issue of education in the federal budget, I really wanted to deal with three issues. Firstly, I wanted to talk briefly about what the budget doesn't do for education. I wanted to talk about why it doesn't do it. And then I'm wanting to address the issue of what we're going to do about it. Because I think the critical issue for us here tonight is not to walk away, as is very easy to do in a state of despair, about the treatment of a federal government that has lost faith in the Australian people, that has no vision for the future, and is incapable, in my view, of actually understanding what the needs and wants of the Australian people are, because they're driven by agendas that most of us are never able to understand. So it's critical to me that we do have a vision for the future, and that's what we have as a collective role to provide to the community, because they're not getting it from the federal government. In terms of what the budget doesn't do for education, and Alex has hit the nail on the head here, really what we see in 2015 was an explanation of the pain in 2014-15, which has simply been rolled over in 2015-16. For education, it's about a denial of the most basic entitlement to education for many of our Australian citizens. Because what the Abbott government proposes to do in terms of funding, not next year or the year after, but in the year after that, is to strip, over a 10-year period, some $30 billion out of education funding in this country. At a time when the community has worked together to debate the issues of what our education system should look like, and has focused and embraced a concept that says that education in this country should be about making sure that there is equity of opportunity. That no matter where you go to school, no matter what your disadvantage, you should have the same opportunity as every other person who's going to school in that school with you. And the Gonski Review said that there are 6 key causes of disadvantage: socioeconomic status, being a person of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, a person for whom English language proficiency is an issue, a student with a disability, a person who is living in a small, rural or remote community and goes to a small school. All of those things are creating disadvantage for Queensland kids every single day in classrooms around Australia. In some classrooms, not so many. And that means both in private and public schools. In other classrooms, lots. And what this funding proposal was about was saying, let's recognise the needs of each one of those individual children and make sure that they get the funding that they need to have the maximum opportunity to achieve positive educational outcomes. Because what the world knows is that a good educational outcome for individual students will lead to economic prosperity for the community as a whole. If every child is achieving to the best of their ability by being given those opportunities, then the whole community benefits from that. You know, we've already heard tonight very significant issues attached to poverty in terms of domestic violence and issues such as that in our community. I've got to say that what teachers deal with day in, day out in schools is tightly bound to that issue of poverty, is tightly bound to the issue of fractured families and circumstances in our society that feed into the issues that students face when they come to school each day. And that's what that funding was about. Many people will say to me, Kevin, lots of people accept that Gonski was a good thing, but they can't explain to me what Gonski was about. I say to you that that's the one simple thing that you need to remember. The technical stuff is what the politicians and teachers and others will work out. What you need to understand is what we're trying to do is to make sure that every child, regardless of where they go to school, has the maximum opportunity to have good outcomes from education. It's as simple as that. This budget denies students that opportunity. This budget takes away from the most vulnerable of our citizens an opportunity to experience success and to have a happy future. And that's something we should all condemn. In Queensland, over the next 3 years, just to put it in really hard, cold terms, in Queensland over the next 3 years, $466 million missing from the budget that will be provided to the state to provide education. Now, that's a number that really boggles me. I'm a social science teacher, as was introduced, and numbers do my head in, quite frankly. But I like to put it in people terms. $466 million actually represents 1,500 teachers, 1,500 teachers every year for the next 3 years. That's what that money represents. There are about 30,000 teachers in Queensland state schools. If that $466 million was there in the budget for the state education system, there could be 1,500 teachers every year for the next 3 years added into the system. Now, we wouldn't spend it all on teachers, but what I'm getting at is that helps me to understand, and I hope you too, what that money actually looks like. 1,500 teachers. So that's really what we're being robbed in Queensland in terms of the education budget alone. It's money that this state should be getting. It's money that the Gonski proposals, negotiated with the nation as a whole, would have delivered. But of course, we had a double whammy here because you might remember there was a mob in government a little while back, the LNP, who in fact denied Queenslanders a stake in the Gonski reforms by refusing to sign up to that particular agreement. And you know, the gentleman who was the Education Minister, to my great chagrin, stood up at a meeting of principals at the end of last year and told them that the reason that he refused to sign up to the Gonski agreement was because he's a politician and it's a political decision. Not anything about kids, not about education, not about opportunity, not about equity, but because he's a politician and this was a political decision. So what does that tell you about what these people are doing in terms of the decision-making processes they're engaged in? It tells you that it's certainly not our interests that are at the forefront of their minds when they're drawing up the budget. So let's look at some real reasons as to why this education budget is where it is. And unfortunately, we have to look beyond our own borders to get a bit of an idea. There's a lot of research going around at the moment into the issue of the marketisation of education. Marketisation of education, meaning that there is an enormous pool of money that is available essentially to be pillaged by the corporate world. The education spending in this world, our globe, runs into trillions of dollars annually. Trillions of dollars. And less than a fraction of 1% of that money is in private hands at the moment. Because what most nations have recognised is if you have an education system that's run for profit, it completely loses sight of the fact that the place of that education system is to serve the students that are there to be educated, not to serve the profit intent of the shareholders of the companies who own the schools. So in Sweden and the UK and the US, where we see the worst of this happening, we've seen for-profit schools put in place. I visited 2 of those nations last year to look at their school systems, and what I saw there honestly just leaves me absolutely flabbergasted and in despair for what we might be facing. Because what underpins the Abbott government's philosophy in education is nothing to do with just not liking Australian kids or Queensland kids. And I think that's probably an element of it as well. But it is actually about wanting to set a situation up where their mates in the big end of town can get a huge share of the multi-billion dollars of government expenditure that's actually going out into the community to support the education of our children. That's what it really is about. Now, if you don't believe me, then I'd like to say to you that the reality is in fact already being visited upon us through the TAFE system. When you look at what's happened to TAFE in this nation as a consequence, sadly, of the concerted efforts of Labor and the Conservative governments that we've had, is that our TAFE system has been pillaged already. What we've seen in Victoria is a blowout in the TAFE budget of over $400 million a year, every cent of that going into the pockets of private providers on a for-profit basis. $400 million straight into their pockets. Companies set up by sadly, Labor politicians, one by the name of Vocation, that you may have read about in the newspapers, that just last week was ordered to pay back $8 million in fees that it collected from the government for courses that it didn't actually ever provide. It takes enrolments and it delivers certificates for those people who complete the courses, and it takes its $8 million and walks away, but they're never actually taught anything. Now that's being done in college after college, in circumstance after circumstance, because what Vocation's model is they simply outsource. They subcontract to people who have no qualifications, no infrastructure or system, no quality assurance processes, and aren't answerable to ASQA, which is the standards commission in this nation, because Vocation's the one that's actually providing the certification at the end. That's what is in sight for the education system at a school level if we can't do something about this. That's what the world is telling us is happening right around. I will just digress for a moment. This has nothing to do with our budget, but I do have to say that it's such a moving story that I want to share it at this stage, because we're currently engaged at a world level where we represent as a union movement some 30 million teachers right across the world in a campaign to free developing nations from the grip of these same companies that I'm talking about. In Africa at the moment, we have seen a massive growth in child poverty and child labour because of the intervention into those nations of companies that are now providing school for a low fee, low quality schools in those communities. The governments, as a consequence of corrupt practices, have been bought by the companies like Pearson's, for example, who are going into those communities and providing a fee for a school for only $1 a day. And you know, they promote them as it's very low cost. In a country where salaries, earnings in those families can be as little as a few dollars a week. Those children are then going out and working on a day so that the next day they have their dollar to be able to go to school and pay their fee. If they don't pay their fee, they don't get an armband. If they don't get an armband, they don't get access to resources. And it's $1 per day to go to school. So kids are going out and they're working in the dumps and they're collecting and they're working in a whole range of industries to get their $1 to be able to go to school. Because what they know, just as we do, is that it's an education that has the potential to free them from the poverty that they're experiencing. Now that story has been told to me a couple of times now by Angelo Gavrielatis, was the national president of the Australian Education Union, who's now working for Education International, our world union, and running the campaign to defeat those global corporate powers that are running those schools in Africa, South America and in Asia, particularly Indonesia, where they are engaged with corrupt governments on delivering that education process. So what we have ultimately is to do something about that. And what the education unions, in joining with the ACTU at a national level, and certainly recognising the critical role that the Australian Greens have played in supporting those education reforms that would deliver real prosperity for this country and real benefits for Australian kids, is to run a campaign during the lead up to this next federal election. It could be, as Alex said, as soon as before the next budget is handed down. And to see that we run hard in a range of seats. Now, we've already appointed into Queensland 4 target seat coordinators. They take up positions from the 13th of July. The 5th is on their way. Those 4 target seats will be our contribution, hopefully, to seeing a number of Queensland seats fall in the next federal election, which will return government to hopefully a progressive government in Canberra. In reality, of course, it was that hopefully a Labor progressive government, but one that will actually deliver on the promises that have been made over time. Because sadly it was the vacillation of that same party in the last time that they handled government in Canberra that means that we are in this position in the first place. It took them years to deal with something that should have been dealt with quickly, and as a consequence we missed that opportunity. It's an opportunity denied, it's an opportunity squandered in terms of what we could have delivered. I've gone a bit over time, but I did want to just, I guess, wrap up by saying we will rely on you as members of the community to join with us in that campaign. We need our voices to be raised as loud as possible in the upcoming election campaign to make sure that issues such as health and education are on the forefront of voters' minds and are being dealt with in a very real way by whoever wants to lead us as a nation going forward. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about those issues tonight, and I look forward to your support in the election campaign to come.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Obviously there's a major theme emerging tonight, and that is that we need Greens in there to keep fighting for this, and that we want fairness. We want to be able to provide the money that's needed in order to support our teachers, to support our children, and to make sure that it is an equitable process. And so thank you very much, Kevin, for talking that through. Okay, so I asked Larissa earlier if there was anything she'd like me to say. She said, no, just keep it short. Well, so I didn't write anything down. I thought, okay, I'll just wing it. But I was trying to think through all of the things that she's done, and the list is long. So I'm not going to mention that too much. She's done so much in her position in the Senate, but she's also done an enormous amount out of that spot. And I have the good fortune of having gone to university with Larissa, and so I know firsthand that she has been a passionate, committed, compassionate person, as long as I've known her, and I know her dad's in the audience, and I would suggest that he would say even longer than that. So I guess in introducing Senator Larissa Waters, I think it's important to remember that as a person, she is absolutely committed to this agenda and making it a fairer society. And the work that she's done on the reef and domestic violence, and the list again is long, so I won't continue. So I guess first and foremost, I would like you to say, a big congratulations and well done, Larissa, for becoming our co-deputy leader for the Greens. So if you could put your hands together and welcome Larissa, Senator Larissa Waters, co-deputy leader.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you. I said keep it short because I'll get all embarrassed and I need another room for my head after that introduction. Thank you, Kirsten. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Turrbal and the Yagara people, and their elders both past and present. And I want to thank my fellow speakers for making time tonight in their incredibly busy schedules, taking time out from the work they do, helping people to come and share their expertise with you tonight. So thank you to Alex and Kevin and Karyn for your time. Thank you all for coming along tonight. It's the budget's a real opportunity for us to think not only about, well, what does this do for my hip pocket, but if you're concerned about the state of the planet and the state of our community, as I think most of us here are, to think about what the budget will do to our country and what it will do to the shape of our society. So I guess that's the prism in which I viewed the budget, and I want to make some comments tonight about particularly environment and domestic violence. They're going to be short because there's not much in the budget on either of those things. I want to then talk briefly about some of the other key features that the Abbott government focused on in their budget. And then I want to talk about what I think they should have done instead. So I'm keen also to leave lots of time for questions because I'm most interested in hearing what you want to hear about. So I will try to keep my remarks relatively short. As I said, the environment, well, there's really not much in this budget for the environment. We've had the last 3 years of this government gradually reducing the federal government's role in that sphere, trying to give away what limited powers they have over things like World Heritage Areas and the reef and delegate that all down to state governments. They've cut so far about a quarter of the staff of the Environment Department. They've been reducing funding for environment groups. They're now out to attack the tax deductibility status of those same environment groups so that you and I, when it comes to tax time, want to support the causes we believe in, can't claim that as a tax deduction. They haven't gotten that change through yet, and I hope we'll be able to block that one as well. But the agenda has not been a positive one on the environment, to say the least. And so this budget really continues that. It's essentially an ignore budget. And if anyone watched Joe Hockey's budget speech on budget night, you won't have noticed the words climate change in his speech anywhere. I was waiting for that, and I was not surprised when it didn't happen. Climate does feature in one sense in the budget, though, because Bjorn Lomborg, that well-known statistician, not a climate scientist, but a statistician who is, of course, a climate skeptic, gets $4 million for a new climate centre, which of course the University of Western Australia has said, hey, we don't want to be associated with this charlatan, so they're now out of the running. And I suppose he may well sue me after those remarks because I keep forgetting that we're being live streamed, but bring it on. So $4 million for a climate crank when the CSIRO funding has been cut, when we're losing more and more scientists in this nation, and when research and development funding is now at an all-time low. So this is the state of science and the environment under the current government. It is not a positive sign. In fairness, they did add a few additional dollars to the reef because, as I hope you've noticed, the reef's in a whole lot of strife, and there's been a lot of people saying to them, for God's sake, stop building new coal ports and start actually treating this World Heritage icon like the icon that it is. And so they've cobbled together an extra $100 million. Where do you think they've gotten that from? From the land care program. Because of course the environment doesn't deserve any new funding, you've just got to take it from other funding envelopes that's otherwise helping the environment. So again, it speaks volumes in terms of their attitudes. In terms of domestic violence, and I've done quite a bit of work on that, and I was particularly grateful for Karyn's comments tonight, again, for all of the rhetoric that the government has recently taken to promulgating, including the appointment of the wonderful Rosie Buddy as Australian of the Year, for all of their recent talk, absolutely no reversal in this budget of the huge cuts that the last budget delivered. And that really, I think, was a key theme of this year's budget. It was about locking in those awful changes from last time and trying to chuck in a few sweeteners to try to make people forget about how awful last year's budget was, and trying to somehow appear that they've changed their spots. It's pretty clear what their spots are, and it's pretty clear that this document, as I thought Alex articulated beautifully, is a political document that was designed to distract and, to be quite honest, to save Tony Abbott's job. Now, it looks like he's done that for now, and I agree with Alex that we're probably now headed to a very early election. I say, awesome, bring it on. I can't wait to see the back of this government, and I hope that Australians feel the same. Let's hope, yeah, that deserves a clap, agreed. Yeah, let's hope that these budget sweeteners, which I'll come to right now, are not enough to make people forget about the huge cuts to the environment sector, the huge cuts to the public service and to the services that they deliver, the $80 billion that was cut from health and education, which both Alex and Kevin took us through in great detail, the millions cut from homelessness services, the fact that they wanted to put a GP co-payment on for people to go see a doctor, the fact that they wanted to make people wait 6 months, job seekers under 30 who are trying to get work and want to study, can't afford to study because university's so expensive, finding it hard to get work because the job situation's not that great. How is penalising them with no income for 6 months going to help them get a job? I don't understand. They never really explained that. On that note, though, I want to acknowledge that we were able to block a lot of the worst cuts in that last budget, and gee, it felt great to be able to sit in that Senate and stop some of the worst of their ideology that they were trying to wreak on this country. We'll continue to do that, and it's a real privilege and quite a morbid pleasure to be able to do that. We were able to stare them down on the Medicare co-payment. We were able to stare them down on the higher education cuts. And I guess that's why it's tinged with sadness that this week we saw a deal being done to cut the renewable energy target. I'll only speak briefly on this because it's not technically a budget question. But we had the numbers to keep our fantastic, strong renewable energy target at 41,000 gigawatt hours. And unfortunately, the two big parties have now agreed that they'll cut that by a third. And that will really put a spanner in the works for large-scale solar. It'll be okay for wind because, you know, they're faster to produce energy. But, you know, right at this point in global history, when we know that the climate science is perfectly clear and there's really only a few people left standing that don't get climate science, they just happen to be in the parliament, more's the pity, right at this point in history to nobble an industry that was really burgeoning and creating thousands and thousands of jobs, just as the fossil fuel sector is dwindling, because the rest of the world is starting that transition to clean energy, and hence the coal price is tanking, and so the layoffs are beginning. Why on earth would you nobble a renewable energy sector? So that's the backdrop of the budget. It's clearly they just don't get science, and they don't get equity, and they don't get fairness, and they don't really think the government should exist. It's kind of a bit weird that they're actually in government but don't really believe in government delivering services. I don't quite know what they think they're meant to be doing. So they've locked in a lot of the cuts from last time on the domestic violence issue. They locked in those cuts to homelessness funding. They did reverse some of the cuts to legal aid, and they did reverse some of the cuts to homelessness programs after some sustained advocacy from a whole range of people, because they are a bit sensitive to media pressure, this mob, and one would hope that they're also sensitive to constituent pressure. So again, as a few of the other speakers have mentioned, and Kirsten said as well, make sure you let your parliamentary representatives know what it is that you want from them and the priorities that you would like them to pursue, because this is meant to be a representative democracy, and at the moment, as Christine Milne said, my wonderful colleague and mentor and most recently leader of our party, at the moment we've got government for the rich, by the rich. It's a plutocracy. It's not a democracy anymore. we can fix that. That's up to all of us to do. And this budget is just yet another opportunity to remind this government that actually it's people that vote, it's people that matter. We need a planet to live on, and the private profits of multinational mining corporations ain't really helping ordinary Australians, and they're certainly not helping the climate. And, you know, come on, can't we have a bit of a better vision than that? I do want to leave time for questions, but there were a few other things I wanted to mention. Oh yes, revenue raising. It seems to be a bit of a dirty word for this government. They are all keen on making cuts left, right and centre, and we know that the gap between the rich and poor in this nation as well as globally is widening. And we know that actually, well, I believe that government is there to help try to close that gap, and that you get the best out of people when you support them rather than punishing them, and you assist them to have access to health and education, encourage them into the workforce. Right when we know that gap is widening, you see a complete absence of vision for revenue raising to fund those services. So they're just talking more and more about cuts and cuts and cuts, and they're still not really talking about, well, where could we get money from if we actually wanted to fund health and education properly, if we wanted to fund environment programs and science and homelessness and domestic violence programs, where would you get that from? As part of the last government, the Greens agreed with the then Gillard government that we would like a parliamentary budget office set up, which is like an independent treasury, if you like. It's like a body that can cost promises made by politicians, so that members of the public know that you're not just making stuff up, that it's actually an economist and a pointy head has done all of the figures, and yes, it adds up. That's a bit of a crass way of summarising it, but you get the picture. So the Parliamentary Budget Office have costed some proposals that we've put to them in the last year or so. And we've got some revenue raising measures which would raise $79 billion over the forward estimates. That's a lot of money. And it won't surprise you that it's from the big end of town who can afford to pay. So it includes things like bringing back our carbon price, which we know not only was a huge revenue raiser at about $18 billion, could have brought in over the next 4 years, as well as bringing down greenhouse gas pollution. The mining tax, which had some loopholes, but hey, instead of abolishing it, maybe you should have closed the loopholes so that it could raise some revenue. Bringing that back would be about an extra $10 billion. Importantly, and I'm pleased to see that the Labor Party is talking about this in recent weeks now too, is superannuation tax concessions. At the moment, if people know, if you put additional contributions into your super, it gets taxed at 15%. Now, most people are on an income tax rate that's significantly higher than 15%, unless you're, earning under $20,000 as students and casuals would be. So, long story short, it's a tax incentive for you to put money into your super because you get taxed less than if you took that as income. And so what's happened is that the very well-off who have access to good accounting advice have been using this as effectively an income tax dodge. And so there's about $10 billion of foregone revenue, it's 10.8 over 4 years, of foregone revenue because the government is letting people dodge income tax by putting money into super. Now, we think it's a good thing that people put money into super. Of course, you should save for your retirement, particularly if the government's going to attack the aged pension, but which comes at the expense of paid parental leave and family tax benefits and the aged pension asset change. So, sorry, and if anyone's got questions on that, I will go into that. Just on the small business issue though, so what the government has announced is that final decisions yet, but certainly we took a small business tax cut to the last election as, it's the engine room of our economy, as one of those hackneyed phrases is, and as one of the largest employers in our nation, small business does need a bit of a lift. The other aspect that they've brought in on small business is, of course, the $20,000 that you've probably heard of. So this is what's called the instant asset write-off, and it's a way of basically rapidly depreciating the purchase of business-related goods, such that you basically claim the whole purchase as a tax deduction in that first year that you bought it. Normally you depreciate things over a longer period of time. The interesting thing here is this looks a lot like the stimulus package that the last government brought in that the Greens supported because the global financial crisis has knocked us around a bit. And of course the Abbott opposition at the time railed against stimulus, so interesting change of position there. But it's also interesting because the instant asset write-off used to be at $5,000. The Abbott government cut it to $1,000, and now they're upping it to 20,000. So they're sort of all over the shop, and it really puts paid to the notion that this is a change of views by them. It's clearly a political document designed to win votes, to shore up Abbott's own job, and Hockey's for that matter. There are some concerns about the fact that that $20,000 is unlimited next 2 weeks, but some good, but some notes of caution there. And of course, with the tax office being completely slashed, well, how on earth are they going to police compliance with the rules?
Thanks, Larissa. Gentleman up the back. Pass the mic.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name's Thomas Brooks. If the listener knows who I am. If you gentlemen from the two trade unions want to know who I am, according to the Australian newspaper, I'm a professional protester. That was on the front page of the Australian. Larissa, one thing I just wanted to mention to you is this instant write-off of $20,000. That applies to a company's gross income. There's a serious flaw in that, because just to take a friend of mine who has a hardware store, they have a huge turnover in the millions of dollars, but a very, very small profit margin. And I don't see anything attended to those sort of companies, which is quite a lot of companies. I think that's something the Greens need to bring up. My question to the two trade union presidents here, sorry, I've forgotten your name, I think it was Kevin and Alex, sorry about that. My question to you, and I'm probably a little bit off topic on the night, is my question to you is the Labor Party's budget. To me, this is a personal opinion, choosing between the LNP and the ALP is like choosing between cancer and leukemia. And it's not meant to be funny. That's a serious statement. Why can't the unions, and look, the Greens are fairly closely associated with the Labor Party. But God knows other question than who want to be associated with the LNP, but why can't the unions bring the Labor Party to account by shutting off their budget? Now, you guys are the biggest contributors to the ALP, is all the union in Australia. And I don't see you guys standing up to them and saying, this is not on, and if you keep doing it, we'll cut off your money. And that, to me, is what I see needs to be done. My focus is on the coal seam gas industry. I've been arrested and jailed for it. Who brought it in this state? The Labor Party did. Who's continuing with it in this state? The Labor Party is. Now, they need to be brought to account. And I really like to see the unions become much more proactive in bringing the Labor Party to account. Not just the Greens, but the people who are contributing the money to them. And I'm willing to talk to you about it afterwards if you would like to talk to me after that.
Sadly, you've hit on two unions here that aren't affiliated with the Labor Party. So we make absolutely no contributions to them. And our constitution, and Alex's union is in a slightly different position, but our constitution, now 126 years old, actually forbids us from affiliating with a political party unless there's a referendum of all the members to make that decision on their own behalf. Now, what that means is that we can stand as an independent voice. We can work with the Greens if it suits us. We can work with Labor if it suits us. It may even be that there's another political party that we could work with if they were doing the right thing. Heaven forbid that they ever would, because I'm not sure how I would manage that as a personal issue. So I have to say to you that I acknowledge what you're saying, is that there does seem to be an obvious link between those who fund, but in this particular circumstance, you've happened upon two unions who actually don't contribute anything to the ALP and who do stand as independent voices on our members' behalf, because that's what we're there to do.
I'd just say the same thing.
Okay, do we have any more questions from the floor?
Mark Taylor, North Brisbane branch of the Greens, and also proud member of the Australian. It's been said on the back of recent election results in Europe, in Greece, in Britain, and in other countries that the base of social democratic parties is shrinking but progressive parties and movements can win on the back of strong community campaigns, and the strong and engaged community campaigns are the way that progressive movements can win these days. I know I'd like to hear your comments around that, because what I'm hearing is that neither party is presenting a vision for Australia through the budget. A lot of people have said there's no vision from the LNP of a better Australia, but there's also no vision from Bill Shorten either. And I know Alex's union Together have really engaged with the community and community campaigns, and we have had successes on issues through community campaigning at the state elections. So just like your comments on that.
I think the issue around politics is that the major parties, the population is becoming very disillusioned with mainstream politics, and I think from that perspective, the challenge for progressive groups is finding ways of getting politicians who listen to the community. And I think the idea of social democratic parties suffering in some of the countries you mentioned, I think, is more about parties generally suffering across the board, other than those who are heavily supported by Murdoch Press and others, whether it be the Tories in England or the Liberals in Australia. As a member of no political party, I think the issue for anybody in the community is finding a way of having their voice achieved, both in terms of community campaigning, and we've done a lot of work through the Together Union about that. But at the end of the day, we do then need to find good politicians who can stand up for the issues. But the thing I would dispute, I do think Tony Abbott has a vision. I just think it's a bad vision. I'm not sure about Bill Shorten, but in terms of I think it's a real mistake to assume that the Conservative parties don't have a vision. It's not a vision we share, or it's not a vision I share. It's a very different vision of the sort of society Australia has. They buy elections, and this budget was about buying the next election, but last year's budget was very much a vision for the future. So I think it'd be a mistake for progressives to think that they are vacuous and without vision. Particularly the Conservative side of politics have a very strong vision. The problem is they hide it at election time because it's not the vision that Australians have.
I'll add just very, very briefly, but I think, and I know I've heard Alex say this on a number of occasions, so I'll quote him back to himself. Really, I think we demonstrated the capacity of a union movement to actually deliver a strong community campaign when we defeated the Howard government in the Work Choices election. And what that was about was a union movement that really did meld with the community at a fundamental level about the issues that really mattered. And I think that was a demonstration of our capacity, which has the Conservative powers in this country fearful of what we might do if we ever get back to that. Because unfortunately, as Alex has wanted to say, we lost our way after Work Choices. We forgot to continue the campaign. We forgot to keep going with the fact that it's not good enough just to get a government elected that's made a lot of promises. You have to hold them to account for the promises that they've made. And regardless of the colour of their politics, it's about ensuring that what people need is being delivered. So I think community campaigning is absolutely at the core. I think that as a union movement we demonstrated we can do that. We've got to get back to it because we missed the boat after Work Choices.
Just from the not-for-profit world, I think it's really important that governments stop, silencing the not-for-profit sector because they receive government contracts, but also that there's a lot of talk about a civil society. I think that we lack we need more skill development in advocacy. We need to talk about what advocacy is. It needs to not just be through political parties and unions. It needs to be organisations who every day see the reality of, women dying, children being displaced, homelessness or poverty, whatever the issues, disability, the experience of people with disabilities. Like those experiences, the Australian people need to know, citizens need to know how other citizens live, and not-for-profits have a voice that should be valued and respected, and we need to be called to account for being accurate and doing it properly, and making sure that we're not misleading the public, making sure we're not using funding that is for service delivery for advocacy. But we've got to a point where the right to advocate, and there's more than one ways to silence it, like defunding, of course, is the ultimate way, but perceptions of defunding have had a greater role. And just on one hand, we're told to inform the community, get the business sector involved, get everyone else involved to contribute funding. So government has to contribute funding. Yet the minute anybody can be called up by anyone to say, well, what were you saying on the radio? And you shouldn't be saying it, or getting a call from a government department. And I think that if we're really committed to a social system that is fair and equitable, well, we've got to give not-for-profits that rightful role, and we've got to really look at how the privatisation of the not-for-profit sector is happening, even though it's not at the, your points about education, but it's happening in everywhere. And I think that the community and the economy have to be seen hand in hand, and the economy needs to work for the community, and the community needs to, be engaged in the economy. We don't ever hear governments tell you how much we pay back in tax or how much organisations are contributing back. So I think there is a need to really appreciate what we mean by a civilised society and the role of not-for-profits in it, and to be able to campaign on issues of inequality, and give the facts to people, because often that's what's missed. And in domestic violence, we've seen the lack of advocacy drop because we were talking about inequality of women, because we were talking about women's dying and not men. And I think that those facts, the lack of, is why we're in the situation now, because we stopped putting forward what were the real issues that women were experiencing and the inequality. And a lot of that was to do with government contracts.
I might just add briefly, but I'd firstly like to endorse all of those comments, and good question, Mark, one of our founding Greens members here in Queensland. I take heart from the fact that the current representation of the federal parliament, at least, has the most non-big party members in it. And sure, it's a bit colourful at the minute, but detail aside, I think people are searching for, politicians with vision, but politicians with conviction, who, to be perfectly honest, aren't on the take. And I think that in order to bring back community voice in Parliament again, we need to clean up political donations, because currently the vested interests have so much more influence over our current decision makers than do the community and voters, which is clearly the system's meant to be about representing people, not about vested interests. Donations really is a massive scourge. So cleaning that up would be the first systemic way to try and bring community back into the Parliament. But I take heart from community activism, and I take heart from some significant wins. I don't think the community's disengaged. I think they're crestfallen at the state of politics, but I don't think they're disengaged in the process. There's huge online activism now in the political sphere. That's a great opportunity for us all, because it's not filtered through the Murdoch press, who have their own agenda, as we've canvassed tonight. So that's something we should all be using, and certainly, speaking with your friends and colleagues about political issues. Everyone's got a strong view. So there's certainly interest there, but I do take heart from the fact that communities can win. One of my early experiences at my old job in the Environmental Defenders Office, and when I was starting out with the Greens, was the Mary River campaign. And that was the most wonderful testament to people power, because we did win that fight in the end against all odds, and it was such a wonderful thing to be part of and to cling to and be reminded of in the dark times. I also got to go to the Bentley blockade, and that's where I had a chat to Thomas. That was another win, where you just had a huge display of people power that just wouldn't take no for an answer, and the New South Wales government had to buckle. on that same theme, in the New South Wales state election, CSG was a huge issue. We just saw a regional seat change from a National Party member to a Green for the first time off the back of opposing coal seam gas, because the community is that up in arms about it. So I'm still hopeful that we can change the system. I'm aware that it needs a drastic reform, but I think I'm optimistic about.
Oh, hi, I'm Jenny Mulkearns. Just interested, the social services is probably my bag of a lot of this and where you all stand. I think at the moment the government likes to invest in the bottom of the cliff. And in health we invest in machines that go ping, ambulances and lots of buildings, and not in stopping people becoming unwell. In education, we're not investing in proper schooling for those that are falling off the edge. In our social services, we invest in on-the-ground homelessness services, not in housing. So it's all reversed, and it's not very difficult to understand. If you invest at the top end, at the front end, rather than the pointy end where people are needing it, that people won't fall over that cliff. You won't need to invest in more and more beds. You won't need to invest in more and more outreach services, because you're actually investing appropriately, and it will have an offshoot for other things, like in the money that goes into other types of social services like welfare. If you invest appropriately in getting people well, they get jobs and they get off welfare. If you invest appropriately in NDIS, people with disabilities can get jobs and get off welfare. The government's just got to ask about, from my perspective.
Was that more of a comment? It's an excellent comment, that's right.
Needing good policy, and policy isn't just about ideas, it's about going further than the ideas and looking at the evidence and really building on what works, instead of the same ideas going around and it being a competition of ideas. Really building a good evidence-based approach. We know housing is the solution to homelessness, but we also know that it's not enough, so that people do need to have the health services and other services, whether that be their disability or their addiction or their mental health. But you know, there's no infrastructure money going into the community sector. There's just nothing. It's just small amounts of money that have been rearranged, and wasn't rearranged very well.
Thank you. So we actually only have a few minutes left. I'm going to throw to an online question, and if we've got time, we'll squeeze one more in the audience. So this is for Alex from Eileen, and she asks, with casuals being employed via recruitment agencies, there's no safety net for 40% of employees. What can be done?
I think the real tragedy around the casualisation of the workforce, which is incredibly much higher in Australia than it is any other country in the world, maybe other than maybe Spain, has been that there's been an assessment made by which the unions have been culpable in, through the industrialisations process, that has said that the ability to cash out long service leave, rec leave, annual leave, everything else to a dollar amount, and people aren't worse off, has meant that employment security is now zero. The fact is that if you look at the straight mathematics about what the casual loading comes from, it's about the issue of the straight mathematical calculation is that your cost of your annual leave and everything else exactly comes to the amount you get in the loading. And I think the whole issue around casualisation has been a terrible mistake by the union movement, but it's only one of a series of elements about precarious employment. And those precarious employment driving, whether it's independent contractors and some of the sham arrangements there, temporary employment in the public sector, casualisation across a range of industries, has really been about trying to reduce workers to widgets. So they have no rights and they have no ability to enforce those rights in a collective sense. So I think the challenge for the union movement is coming up with a way of finding the empowering workers to be able to move away from casual workforce to a permanent and sustainable workforce. And the challenge around that for individual workers is that they then lose money on a day-by-day basis. Because once people are in a casual environment, they start to factor in the loading into paying their bills. And while they really want the certainty of knowing what their shifts are next week and the week after, the problem at the moment is they take a pay cut on a weekly basis to get that employment security. So we need a really large change in the way we think about industrial relations in Australia to make sure that we start to really value the notion of permanency and to start to deal with the scourge of casualisation. But it's only going to happen through legislation because in the current industrial environment, the dice are so heavily weighted against individual employees that there needs to be some significant legislation. There isn't agreement in the union movement about what that looks like, but it certainly is an issue that the movement is trying to grapple with in the lead up to the next ACTU Congress and then in the lead up to the next federal election, because casualisation is destroying lives, and it's not just about the money, it's also about the human cost, about the fact that people don't know, they can't get bank loans, they can't get housing loans, there's a range of things they can't get, but day to day they wake up and don't know, have to wait for that phone call to know whether they're getting a shift this week. And so the zero-hour contract stuff in Britain and more generally is, I think, where we need to having that debate about the quality and nature of work, and as part of that process then dealing with casualisation in a holistic sense, but it will require leadership from the union movement to talk to workers and get community support for legislative change.
The only thing I'd add to what Alex has just said, I think, is it's important to remember that casualisation and precarious employment is a gendered issue. It disproportionately impacts on women workers, and so, as a union that represents a workforce, 75% of which are women, we see it in our own numbers, and teachers are a relatively safe and secure profession, so we don't have the same levels of casualisation and temporary employment that we see in the public service generally or throughout the workforce as a whole. But we have to acknowledge that gendered issue, because the disproportionate impact on women means that this issue is one that in fact plays into the hands in many ways of that vision that Alex talked about of this current federal government, because if you can attack the basis of our society, which is in many ways the safety and security of those who are responsible for your family responsibilities and other issues, then that's a way of keeping people down. Let's be honest. And I mean, that sounds, the conspiracy theories, and it sounds a bit Marxist, but I mean, the reality is, I think, to me, it's about oppression. If we can oppress people who, in fact, should have a voice, then we're a better chance as a government of being able to be re-elected, because those with the money who can deliver on the advertising and use the Murdoch press and so on can carry the day in terms of buying the votes.
Okay, we're going to just try and squeeze the one last question in, but bear in mind we do have a few minutes at the end to have a bit of a mingle, and you might be able to snag some of these wonderful invitees. So over to you.
Hi, my name's James, West Brisbane Greens. Just wondering, it goes back to something that Larissa touched on in the last question. How do we get back control of the discourse? I mean, we are engaged, we're all here, we're all at a meeting on our own time. A lot of people do read the papers, unfortunately a lot of them Murdoch press, but when cuts become savings, and we saw it within a week, cost signal became a value signal. Who's against savings and value signals? Who's against illegal immigrants? It goes across the whole thing, and then when it's not just the Murdoch press, it gets picked up by everyone else. How do we get back control of the discourse?
Oh, if I knew that, I'd be ruling the world. Fantastic question, James, and you're exactly right. And particularly this government has used tricky language to great effect. I mean, they're the master of three-word slogans, and clearly that's worked for them politically. Let's hope it doesn't work again. But one thing I will say is in the Senate, I think the answer to your question is you can't ever fall into their framing and always use your own language. And an example of that is whenever they refer to illegal asylum seekers or illegal entrants in the Senate, we stand up every time, and everyone gets very bored and cross at us, but we do it every time and say, on a point of order, it is not illegal to seek asylum. You are using the wrong language, and you are falsely demonising human beings for your own depraved political objectives. So I guess my only answer is challenge it and try to reframe as best as you can and have those conversations with your peers and friends and family. Murdoch Press is very powerful. You don't have to buy their paper. Many people don't anymore. There are other alternative media outlets that are a bit more balanced and actually tend to report facts rather than opinion, which is very welcome. So, you know, subscribe to those. But we know in terms of creating political change, the most effective communication is that person-to-person communication. So that's why I keep harping on about it. It's a powerful thing. We need to all be having those conversations, and you know, sometimes they're uncomfortable if you've got awkward families. I'm blessed that I don't. Hi, Dad. Thanks for coming tonight. But yeah, just watch your language and challenge that discourse, and hopefully it seeps in. On that note, interestingly, Bob and Christine and all of our Greens have always referred to the corporate sector as the big end of town. And I think people used to think Bob was a bit daggy calling it the big end of town. I love the phrase and happily use it myself. And it's been used tonight by a few others, and I've actually now started to hear other political figures use that phrase. So that is a triumph of discourse change in my view. It's one tiny example, but I take heart from it.
And look, I think for me too, the critical issue here is about and Larissa said, you know, having those conversations. But to be honest, it really is at that fundamental level about ensuring that people have an option other than despair. Because what I hear time and time again when we have those conversations with people is it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter who is in government. It doesn't matter who I vote for. My vote is irrelevant. Now, if they can't see that, in fact, that's exactly what those in power want them to think, because in a system where everyone gets a vote and every vote should be equal, they are just as powerful as any other individual in our community. So where else does that message come from but from the very language and the very philosophy that you've described as being used by government? It's about saying to people it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you vote for, it will make no difference at the end of the day. And I think tonight we've also heard about the very big difference that can be made, because there is absolutely no doubt that we would be in a significantly bigger pickle in our current circumstance, socially, politically, economically, if it weren't for the power of the Senate to actually take real steps to change the government's agenda to be something that's not as bad for the community as it would otherwise be. So I in those conversations, I don't accept despair as an option. What I say to people is there is ample evidence that we can turn things around, and by the action of us as individuals, but more powerfully as a group, we can make a difference. And I think that's the message of hope that we have to deliver for people. And as a union movement, we've realised that for a long time. You have to build hope, because if all you have is despair, then you're sapped of that energy and the will to actually make the contribution that's needed. And that's what they don't have. Those that we oppose don't have a capacity to actually generate a powerful base grassroots campaign in the community. It's what they fear most. What they can do is buy people to run their campaign for them. But that's not done with the passion and commitment that we get from union members who are buying in, or from political parties, progressive political parties, who are coming to the table wanting to really fight the fight for what is right. And that's what I think we can do to change the discourse, is convince people that there's hope.
Well, thank you very much, everyone for coming along, and for the online listeners and viewers as well. A very big thank you to our panel. What wonderful representatives we have here. Thank you very much. A round of applause. So I know that there are a few people here who didn't get a chance to ask a question. We are going to end the night now, but if you want to mingle a little bit, there is some food and beverages at the back of the room. I think that's essentially it. I guess at the very end of it all, what was it you said? Fight for the right. Fight the fight for right. And I think it's very important that we mention, that we emphasise that. I'm also being told to mention that there are some feedback forms here tonight. There's a box being waved around in the background there. If you like to fill out your feedback forms and drop it in the box, that would be most appreciated. And a very important message as well, that we can all fight the fight, and whether you're a public servant or not, for those of you who are public servants, you can say something outside of work with your private hat on. Don't feel afraid, and I think that's a really important message. It's good to have the hope. It's good to know that you're actually safe and that you can say things. So thank you very much, everyone.